You might have seen this viral chart which claims to show that there is no such thing as a low energy rich country. And today I don't want to argue against the chart itself because I don't think it was ever intended to stand up to thorough analysis, but I do want to argue against the idea which this chart inspires, and that is the idea that energy causes prosperity. Because I don't know who made this chart originally, but I've seen it shared many times, and always it's shared in support of this idea that energy causes prosperity. And I don't think that this idea is entirely wrong, but I do believe that it is almost entirely wrong. So hello YouTube, I'm Michael Size, and I want to support my model in two ways. Number one, I want to show that prosperity does not come from energy, and number two, I want to show that an influx of energy does not by itself induce prosperity. So starting with number one, let's consider the following thought experiment. If you imagine you have no running water and you can't live next to the river because it's full of mosquitoes, and so you live a few kilometers away and you have to carry the water every day using buckets or something. This process burns about 350 calories per day or about 0.4 kilowatt hours of food energy. So that's our benchmark energy consumption, but this is not a very prosperous existence. So how can we increase your prosperity? Well, I can think of at least three solutions here. Solution number one is that I give you a car, so now the task of carrying water is going to take less time than before, perhaps 75% less time, and a lot less effort, and this is definitely higher prosperity, but the car is probably going to consume about 400 milliliters of gasoline to complete the task each day, which is about 4 kilowatt hours, 10 times more energy than in the base scenario. Solution number two is that I give you a well pump and some plumbing supplies, and you dig yourself a well and install literal modern running water in your home. The water travels from the river by itself through the ground, and you just lift it up and pressurize it using an electric pump, and this solution is going to consume perhaps 0.1 kilowatt hours of electricity per day, which is 4 times less energy than in the base scenario. And solution number three, we raise your roof by about 2 meters and we install a giant water tank that's now 2 meters off the ground, and we collect the rainwater from your roof year round, which should be more than enough for your yearly water consumption. And because we've put the water tank 2 meters off the ground, it means that the water is pressurized enough to function as a rudimentary running water system, at least for one household, with no further pumps or anything like that. And this again gets you running water, but this time with an energy consumption of 0 kilowatt hours per day. So at this point I hope you can see what I mean when I say that the prosperity isn't coming from the energy, because in all of these scenarios your prosperity comes from the stuff. Right? The products, the infrastructure, the capex, that's what prosperity comes from. You build products that do things for you, and in this example we saw that you could do that in a way that uses products which use energy, but you could also do that in a way which uses products that don't use energy or use less than what you were using previously. And in fact, in this particular example, we saw that one of the lower energy solutions is actually even more prosperous than the highest energy solution. So the prosperity comes from the stuff. But I want to stick with this example just a little bit longer in order to also try to explain the second point of my argument, because imagine once again that you're in the water carrying scenario and God himself says, here's a magical battery that produces 0.1 kilowatt hours per day at 240 volts 50 hertz and 1 kilowatt of peak power every day forever for free. Well, at this point God gave you all of the energy that you need in order to get running water with a well system. Does it mean that you now have running water? Well, no, but doesn't mean that you're anywhere close to having running water. Also no, in fact your prosperity has barely budged, because the intellectual leap from I have some energy to I'm going to invent running water is actually enormous, and it's much bigger than the intellectual leap when you're going the other way around, where you've invented the well pump and the running water, and now you just need to procure a way to spin the pump. That's much more straightforward, and I would guess that in 99% of cases, if all you had was a 3 kWh per month free energy allowance, yes, you might increase your prosperity a little bit if you figure out something to do with those 3 kWh, but the degree by which you're going to raise your prosperity is going to be a lot smaller than what you would get from installing running water. So in other words, you're going to squander the energy. And this is what I mean when I say that a simple influx of energy does not by itself induce prosperity. But that's enough for the thought experiment. What does history say about it? Well, I think that history makes it abundantly obvious that a sudden decrease in the supply of energy does indeed cause a drop in prosperity. So why is that? And can my model explain this phenomenon? Well, I would say that it can, and here's how. My model says that products provide prosperity, and one way in which you could categorize these products is that there is one subcategory of products that provide prosperity without requiring any energy to function. So for instance, roofs and walls and knives and gravity sewers and roads and insulation and shopping carts and wheels on luggages. But there's also another subcategory of products which provides prosperity while also requiring energy in order to function, such as running water and blenders and boilers and smartphones. So there are two subcategories, and by adding them together we get our total prosperity. And what happens when you get a sudden drop in the energy supplies is that the products in the second subcategory have to reduce their operations, and so we lose some of the prosperity provided by the second category, and this leads to a loss in the total prosperity, even though the share contributed by the first category does not decrease. And so far my model seems resilient, but my model also claims that an influx of energy does not induce prosperity, so what does history have to say about this part? Well, in terms of what happens when the supply of energy suddenly increases, history definitely does not make the answer obvious here. I mean, the only clear example that I can even think of is the oil glut of 2020, which led to negative oil prices but did not lead to much of anything else in terms of prosperity. And I think that the lack of examples might be related to the fact that energy production can easily be down-regulated to match demand, but it's a lot more difficult to up-regulate it when there is a shortage, and this is definitely true for fossil fuels. We'll have to see whether this changes in the age of renewables, but the point is that we don't have an obvious example for true energy glut, so we might have to think about this in a different way in order to get to an answer. Consider this. In the European Union, energy consumption peaked in 2006, and since then it has actually been down by almost 20%. At the same time, GDP is up by about 45% and population is up by over 3%. And I think this clearly demonstrates that prosperity isn't just congealed energy, but it does beg the question if all that energy used previous to 2006 was not necessarily used for prosperity, then what the heck was it being used for? Well, the thing is that efficiency doesn't have a lower limit, or in other words, wastefulness doesn't really have an upper limit, so it's not all that difficult to squander thousands and thousands of terawatt hours every year, and so if you make energy cheaper and more plentiful, that energy is going to be consumed, demand will find a way to absorb all of it, although perhaps not instantly, so demand can inflate to match the supply, but the reason why it inflates is not because people invent new productive things to do with the energy. Instead, people invent new productive things at the same pace as before, and all of that extra energy is just used for doing the same old things, but at lower efficiency. And that's where the energy goes. An influx of energy doesn't induce prosperity, but rather it induces waste. And I'm trying to not sound like a broken record, but this is somewhat of a fine point, and I found that it's very easily misunderstood. So I'm going to say it just one more time and listen closely. People make products that increase prosperity, and one subcategory of these products needs energy in order to function, and as these products accumulate over time, the demand for energy increases, and the people who supply energy increase their supplies to meet the demand. But people make these products at a certain pace, and an increase in the supply of energy isn't going to significantly speed up the pace at which these products are created. Even if the energy does get consumed, that's just because it's being squandered. And now also note that just because a product is invented, that does not mean that the product becomes automatically deployed. For example, mass production of mineral wool was introduced in Europe in 1870, but 155 years later, in 2025, Europe still has hundreds of thousands of buildings with precisely zero insulation on them. So just because you have the technology to be efficient, it doesn't mean that you're actually going to go ahead and be efficient, and when energy is cheap and plentiful, you have a financial incentive to not be efficient. So at this point, I would say that I've provided convincing arguments to support my model, but the last question I want to look at is, why should we care? Are there actual real-life implications, or is this discussion purely academic? I would say that there are, and in the strictest sense, if you actually begin to believe that getting more energy is going to induce prosperity, what you're doing is you're confusing an instrumental goal for a terminal goal, and history has shown that this is potentially disastrous. The closest example that I know to this is China, where the communists made the same mistake with steel instead of energy, and in their push to increase steel production, they ended up killing tens of millions of people by starvation. But in a broader sense, I also find that a lot of people are weirdly adverse to efficiency, because they seem to think it's a waste of time. They'll say things like, efficiency isn't a power plant and just get more energy bro, but efficiency not only achieves the same outcome for a negligible extra cost, as we've seen in the European GDP decoupling, it also offers several other benefits because a smaller customer is a more nimble customer. Needing less energy on a daily basis means that it's easier to switch suppliers, easier to switch energy sources, easier to transport the energy, and even easier to stockpile large amounts of energy as measured in days of supply. As Elon Musk would say, the best energy is no energy. Costs nothing, weighs nothing, can't go wrong, and you don't have to cuck to the Russians and Americans for it. Thank you for watching, like and subscribe.